On January 6 of this year, 2021, a mob of Donald Trump supporters illegally swarmed the United States Capitol building in Washington, D.C., in violent protest against Trump's loss of the presidential election. Lawmakers inside the building fled for safety as Capitol Police lost control of the growing insurrection. In the aftermath of this political violence, several news outlets have called the Capitol riot a traumatic event. And in order to help others understand how the riot was traumatic, Democratic Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez shared a personal video in which she disclosed her own history as a survivor of sexual assault, and she then compared this experience to surviving the Capitol riot. Ocasio-Cortez described how she hid in her office, holding her breath, while rioters broke down wooden doors, screaming, "Where is she?" Ocasio-Cortez said that, quote, "This was the moment where I thought that everything was over. I thought I was going to die." Ocasio-Cortez described how this life-threatening experience caused post-traumatic stress for her, similar to her own past experience of having survived sexual assault. Traumatic events and the post-traumatic stress they create seem especially important to address given events and testimonies such as this. In addition to political unrest, such as the Capitol riot, this past year we have seen an ongoing coronavirus pandemic and mass exposures to racial injustice. It is therefore not surprising to find recent studies report that 70% of adults experience a traumatic event at some point in their lives, and that in America in particular, this statistic jumps to as high as 90%. In light of these findings, it might be fair to agree with trauma psychiatrists of the last decade who have concluded that, quote, "Trauma is now our most urgent public health issue." Scholars in the last 30 years have recognized that traumatic violence is a global public health crisis that can be most effectively approached through interdisciplinary collaboration. Most recently, theologians have begun to join this conversation. There is therefore currently a burgeoning field of research literature exploring how theology can contribute to our understanding of extreme violence on persons and societies, and how religious disciplines might help in facilitating recovery. Concurrent with theological explorations of trauma, there have been several breakthroughs in recent years in empirical science for understanding how trauma disrupts human flourishing. Trauma is therefore an important public health topic that appears a strong candidate for a science-engaged approach, especially given neuroscientific breakthroughs in the study of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Recent findings in neuroscience and psychology famously show that the body keeps the score of PTSD, meaning that the brain-body network of physical organisms' nervous systems is necessary for explaining the effects of post-traumatic stress. Now, while neuroscientists have emphasized the role of the body for explaining traumatic stress, the most influential trauma-informed theologians to date have emphasized pneumatology as a near exclusive reference for explaining how God experiences trauma within a Christian narrative of salvation. Yet, in Christian theology, the divine person of the Holy Spirit has no assumed human body. This raises an important question, a theological puzzle, about how God experiences trauma within a Christian theology of salvation, and in particular, what kind of body might be needed for God to keep the score of post-traumatic stress in a manner consistent with neuroscience. Therefore, in this theological puzzle, I assess whether the neuroscience of PTSD implies a specific doctrine of soteriology in terms of how God experiences trauma within a Christian triduum narrative. This puzzle focuses on the subdisciplines of soteriology, as this has been articulated by trauma-informed theologians such as Shelley Rambo, and the neuroscience of PTSD, as this is evinced in the influential somatic theory of psychiatrist Basil van der Kolk. While theologians engaging trauma have identified Holy Saturday as a promising frame of reference for assessing trauma theologically, Shelley Rambo's emphasis on pneumatology for this assessment confronts some conceptual challenges in the light of neuroscience of PTSD. In particular, Rambo's proposal that God experiences trauma through the person of the Holy Spirit does not obviously square with the somatic nature of post-traumatic stress. Given the neuroscientific studies of van der Kolk, which suggest that the body keeps the score of trauma, I explore the question in this puzzle of whether pneumatology provides a sufficient locus to account for God's experience of trauma. Simply put, does God need a body to keep the score of trauma? And if so, what kind of body might this be? This theological puzzle hypothesizes that groundbreaking studies on the neuroscience of PTSD, in particular the fMRIs discussed frequently by van der Kolk, can constructively inform the approach of theologians like Rambo who deploy trauma theory as a conceptual framework for analyzing the soteriological events of Holy Saturday. If it is true that post-traumatic stress requires a physical organism to explain its effects on an individual, and if we have no reason to suspect that this would be different for a divine person than for a human person, then it is reasonable to assume that in the economy of salvation, God experiences trauma, if he does, in a manner that is more similar than not to the way this is normally experienced by humans in the real world. This has significant consequences for how we articulate God's experience of trauma in embodied terms. So in this puzzle, I hypothesize that the somatic nature of PTSD demonstrated from neuroscientific studies suggests that Christology might actually be a more obviously fitting locus in Christian theology for assessing trauma than Rambo's pneumatology, because Christ is the divine person who has assumed a human body that can keep the score of traumatic stress in a manner most similar to real survivors of trauma. It is hoped in this puzzle that attending to the neuroscience of PTSD for trauma, theology today will open up the possibility for further exploration of how Christian theology can speak meaningfully to trauma survivors in the real world. Thank you.